What happens when the people who betray you at the boardroom forget you've already mastered the game? When they push you out with smug grins, but don't know you've been buying the floor out from under their feet. They thought they'd won when they voted me out, said I lacked senior leadership experience. They smiled as security escorted me from the building my father built. But here's what they didn't know: I'd been preparing for this moment long before they made their move. This is the story of how I turned their betrayal into my greatest victory. My name is Olivia Morgan, and until 6 months ago, I thought blood meant something in business. At 34, I was the only child of James Morgan, founder of Morgan Biotech Solutions, a company that revolutionized cancer diagnostics and made our family name synonymous with innovation in biotechnology. I'd grown up in the shadow of those gleaming laboratories, playing hide-and-seek between centrifuges while my father worked late into the night, driven by a vision to save lives. He raised me to understand every aspect of the business. "You can't lead what you don't understand. Live," he'd say, his eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. So I did it all. Harvard Business School. Yes, but also summers in the warehouse, learning inventory systems from guys who'd been there since the company's founding. I spent 2 years in R&D, pipetting alongside PhD researchers who initially resented the boss's daughter until I proved I could hold my own in experimental design. Sales, marketing, operations, I knew every department, every process, every person who made Morgan Biotech tick. By the time I was appointed Chief Operating Officer at 32, I'd earned it. The board members smiled and applauded Richard Blackwood, my stepfather who'd married my mother 3 years after she divorced Dad. Margaret Liu, Dad's supposed oldest friend from his Stanford days. Thomas Garrett, the silver-tongued investor who'd helped take us public. They all raised champagne glasses to the next generation of Morgan leadership. Dad died on a Tuesday, heart attack at his desk, working on the latest immunotherapy protocol. The coroner said it was instant, no pain. Just gone between one heartbeat and the next. I found him myself, coming in early to review quarterly projections. His coffee was still warm. The funeral was a blur of black suits and hollow condolences. Richard held my mother's arm, whispering how we'd honor James's legacy together. The board members filed past, each gripping my hand and promising their unwavering support. "Your father built something magnificent," Margaret Liu said, tears in her eyes. "We'll protect it, Olivia, for him." 3 weeks. That's how long they waited after we put him in the ground. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Routine agenda, or so I thought, reviewing the Q3 numbers. Approving the new research budget. I walked in with my laptop and my father's lucky pen, ready to continue the work we'd started together. But their faces told a different story. Richard sat at the head of the table, Dad's seat, with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating. The others wouldn't meet my eyes. "Olivia," Richard began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we need to discuss your future with the company." My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. "My future, I'm the COO. My future is right here. That's what we need to address." Thomas Garrett shuffled papers unnecessarily. "The board has concerns about your readiness for senior leadership. You're brilliant. No one disputes that. But running a billion-dollar biotech firm requires experience you simply don't have." "Experience," I laughed, but it came out sharp, brittle. "I've been in this company since I could walk. I know every—" "You know the operations," Margaret interrupted, her tears from the funeral apparently forgotten. "But strategic leadership in the current market, the stakeholders need someone with gravitas, with decades of C-suite experience, someone who can navigate the complexities ahead." "You mean someone who isn't me?" My voice was flat now, the reality crystallizing like ice in my veins. Richard leaned forward, a snake shedding its false skin. "The board has voted, effective immediately. You're being transitioned out of your role. We'll provide a generous severance package. Of course, 6 months' salary, continued health benefits. You can take time to grieve properly. Perhaps consider other opportunities that better match your experience level." The words hit like physical blows. Around the table, 8 faces. People who'd eaten at our family table, who'd celebrated holidays with us, avoided my gaze. Only Richard looked at me directly, and in his eyes, I saw the truth. This had been planned long before my father's body was cold. "You need security to escort me out?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "It's protocol," someone murmured. "For the company's protection." I stood slowly, gathering my things with deliberate calm. My father's pen went into my pocket. They wouldn't get that too. As 2 security guards appeared at the door, I looked each board member in the eye. "You think you've won," I said quietly. "You think you've taken everything." Richard's smirk widened. "Olivia, don't make this harder than—" "I'm James Morgan's daughter," I cut him off. "I learned the game from the man who invented it. And you—" I let my gaze sweep the room one last time. "You have no idea what's coming." The guards flanked me as I walked through the building my father created, past the employees who watched in shocked silence as the founder's daughter was marched out like a criminal. With each step, my humiliation transformed into something harder, sharper. They thought they'd broken me. They thought they'd stolen my birthright with a simple vote and a security escort. They were wrong. The first thing I did after being escorted out was drive to my father's grave. I sat there in my car, engine running, staring at the fresh headstone while my hands shook with rage. Then I made myself breathe. Think, Dad always said emotion was data, but strategy required a cool head. I hired a private investigator that same night, someone recommended by my college roommate who'd gone through a messy corporate divorce. "I need to know everything," I told him. "Every meeting, every email they think is private, every whisper in the hallways." What he found made my blood run cold. The betrayal went deeper than a simple power grab. 6 months before Dad's death, unusual stock transactions had begun. Small blocks of shares changing hands through offshore accounts, always just under the reporting threshold. The pattern was subtle. I only noticed because I knew our shareholder base like my own reflection. Retirement funds in the Caymans, shell companies in Delaware, all leading back to a single coordination point: my stepfather's personal attorney. But that was just the appetizer. The real feast was in the internal communications my PI accessed through a sympathetic IT administrator, encrypted emails between board members, dating back 8 months. They'd been planning this coup while my father was still alive, while they smiled at him across the conference table and toasted his health at company parties. Phase 1 consolidation. Margaret Liu's email was clinical in its betrayal. Once JM is out of the picture, move quickly to sideline O before she can rally support. JM, my father. Out of the picture, my hands clenched around my laptop. The emails revealed their endgame: sell off the company's core research division to Apex Pharmaceuticals, our biggest competitor. The patents my father had spent 20 years developing. The formulas that could save millions of lives, all to be packaged and sold for a quick profit. The board members would walk away with golden parachutes worth tens of millions each. "The old man's too sentimental about his legacy," Thomas Garrett had written. "But once we have control, we can maximize shareholder value properly." Maximize shareholder value. Corporate speak for gutting everything my father built and selling it for parts. I found more in those stolen documents. Richard had been negotiating with Apex for months, promising them our immunotherapy research at a fraction of its worth in exchange for a position on their board. Margaret had been shorting our stock through intermediaries, betting against the company while she sat on its board. It wasn't just betrayal, it was corporate treason. But the document that changed everything was buried in the legal folder: our corporate bylaws, last amended 15 years ago when the company went public. I'd read them before, of course, but never with this kind of desperate attention. And there, in Section 47B, Subsection 3, I found my weapon. In the event of contested control, any shareholder or coalition of shareholders controlling 75% or more of outstanding shares may call an extraordinary meeting and reverse any board decision, including but not limited to personnel changes, with immediate effect. 75%. I pulled up our shareholder registry. The board members collectively controlled 31%. Various institutional investors held another 40%. The remaining 29% was scattered among employees, early investors, and small funds. My father's estate, my inheritance, included 22% of the company. I needed to find another 53%. Impossible. Maybe. But I had something the board didn't expect: the truth about what they were planning. And more importantly, I had relationships with people who actually cared about Morgan Biotech's mission. Dr. Sarah Winters, our head of oncology research, owned 2% stock options accumulated over 15 years. The pension fund of St. Mary's Hospital, one of our first customers, held 3%. Dozens of employees with small stakes, each one someone whose life my father had touched, whose families had benefited from his generosity and vision. The board thought they'd isolated me by throwing me out publicly. They assumed shame would keep me quiet, that I'd slink away to lick my wounds. They didn't understand that they'd actually freed me. Outside the building, I could move without their oversight. I could speak to people without corporate surveillance. I could build my coalition in the shadows they'd pushed me into. That night, I made a list. Every shareholder who might listen. Every employee who'd watched in horror as security marched me out. Every investor who actually believed in our mission rather than quarterly earnings. 53%. It seemed impossible. But then again, so did the idea that people I'd trusted my whole life would betray my father's memory for money. I picked up my phone and dialed the first number. "Doctor," Winters answered on the second ring. "Olivia." "My God, I heard what happened. It's disgraceful. Your father would be—" "Sarah," I interrupted gently, "how would you like to help me save his company?" There was a pause. Then, "What do you need?" I smiled for the first time since the board meeting. It was sharp and predatory, nothing like the trusting smile I'd worn before. "First, I need your shares. Then, I need you to help me make some calls." The war for Morgan Biotech had begun. The board had fired the first shot, but they'd made a critical error. They'd left me alive. My apartment became a war room. Whiteboards covered every wall, mapping out shareholders, their connections, their motivations. I color-coded them: green for confirmed allies, yellow for possibilities, red for those too deep in the board's pocket. The reds were depressingly numerous at first. Dr. Sarah Winters became my first lieutenant. Her 2% was just the beginning. She had connections throughout the medical research community. "Your father saved my career," she told me over coffee that first week. "When I was blacklisted for whistleblowing at my previous company, he hired me without hesitation. I owe him everything." Through Sarah, I reached the St. Mary's Hospital Pension Fund. The fund manager, Robert Chen, initially hesitated. "The board's been calling," he admitted during our clandestine meeting at a downtown cafe. "They're painting you as unstable, grief-stricken. They say you're trying to destroy the company out of spite." I slid him the folder of evidence. His face paled as he read. "They're planning to sell our patent portfolio." His voice shook. "Those cancer protocols have saved thousands of lives at St. Mary's alone. And Apex will vault them, only releasing treatments that maximize profit." I confirmed. "No more subsidized programs for low-income patients. No more compassionate use exceptions." By the end of our meeting, I had his 3% and a promise to reach out to other hospital funds. The employee shareholders were easier to convince, but harder to reach. The board had eyes everywhere inside the building, so I got creative. I haunted the coffee shop across the street during lunch hours. I accidentally ran into people at the gym, the grocery store, their kids' soccer games. Each conversation followed the same pattern: shock at what the board was planning, anger at being kept in the dark, and finally, determination to fight back. Marcus Thompson, a senior lab technician who'd worked with my father for 20 years, owned 0.5%. "They told us you abandoned the company," he said, eyes hard. But I knew that was bullshit. James's daughter would never walk away. "I didn't walk," I said. "They threw me out, and now they're going to throw all of you out too, once Apex takes over." His shares joined my growing coalition. So did those of 17 other employees over the next 3 weeks. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Volkov, portfolio manager at North Star Investments, called me directly. North Star held 7% of Morgan Biotech. Ms. Morgan, her voice was cool, professional. I've been watching some interesting movement in your company's shares. Small lots being accumulated through various channels, all leading back to anonymous LLCs registered in Delaware. Your handiwork. My heart stopped. If she'd noticed, others might have too. I'm also aware, she continued, that your stepfather has been making promises to my competitors about preferential treatment post-acquisition, promises he seems to think North Star will simply accept. Ms. Volkov. I despise being taken for granted. Ms. Morgan, almost as much as I despise seeing a profitable company destroyed for short-term gain. North Star's 7% is yours, on one condition. Name it. When you retake control, you implement the 5-year strategic plan your father presented to us 6 months ago, the one the current board dismissed as too ambitious. Dad's last vision for the company expanding into personalized medicine, opening clinics in underserved communities. Of course, that's what they'd killed. Done, I said without hesitation. With North Star on board, momentum shifted. Smaller funds started returning my calls. The Bernstein Family Trust, early investors who'd believed in my father's first prototype, 4%, the California Teachers Pension Fund, who'd watched their biotech portfolio carefully, 3%. Each percentage point was a victory, recorded in green on my war room walls. But the board wasn't sitting idle. I started noticing surveillance the same car parked outside my building. Random encounters with board-friendly shareholders who tried to gauge my intentions. They were getting nervous. Good. After 6 weeks, I had commitments for 51% of shares. Close, but not enough. I needed that 75% threshold to be untouchable, unchallengeable. That's when I played my first offensive move. I leaked selective information to a friendly journalist, nothing actionable, just enough to spook the market. Sources close to Morgan Biotech suggest major strategic disagreements among board members. Whispers of a potential acquisition have some investors concerned about the company's direction. The stock price wavered, dropped 8% over 3 days. Panic sells began mostly from the smaller, nervous investors who'd rather take a small loss than risk a bigger one. I bought every share, funneling money through the same Delaware LLCs that had first caught Elena's attention. My inheritance from Dad, liquidated, my savings, emptied. I even sold my car, riding the subway like a general traveling in disguise among the common soldiers. By week 8, I controlled 67% through ownership and binding proxy agreements. Still short of my goal, but the board was starting to sweat. Richard called my mother, trying to use her to reach me. Your daughter is going to destroy everything James built, he told her, not knowing I was sitting next to her, holding her hand. My daughter, my mother said quietly, is exactly like her father, and that terrifies you, doesn't it, Richard? The silence on the other end was deafening. I found my final 8% in the last place the board expected their own allies. 2 institutional investors who'd grown tired of the board's promises and lack of transparency. When I showed them the evidence of planned asset stripping, they didn't just give me their proxies, they wanted blood. Corporate governance exists for a reason, one fund manager spat. These bastards think they're untouchable. By week 10, I had it. 75.1% of Morgan Biotech Solutions under my control, the nuclear option, sitting in my briefcase like a loaded weapon. The board had no idea. They thought I was beaten, scrambling in the dark. They were about to learn that sometimes the best place to build an army is in the shadows they cast. The chess game entered its most delicate phase. I had my coalition, but revealing it too early would give the board time to counter. I needed them complacent, confident in their victory. So I gave them exactly what they expected: a defeated Olivia Morgan, ready to strike out on her own. I incorporated Prometheus Biosystems, registering it in Delaware with minimal fanfare. Then I made sure word reached the right ears, a casual mention at a biotech conference, a LinkedIn update about exciting new ventures. Within days, the rumors started spreading through Morgan Biotech's halls like wildfire. Did you hear Olivia's starting a competing company? I heard she's trying to poach the entire immunotherapy team. Someone said she's been meeting with venture capitalists. The board took the bait beautifully. Emergency meetings were called. Memos about protecting intellectual property and non-compete enforcement circulated. They were so focused on the threat they thought I posed from outside. They never saw the real danger accumulating right under their noses. I fed the paranoia carefully. I scheduled very public lunches with key Morgan Biotech researchers, not to recruit them, but to discuss theoretical applications of public domain research. I attended investor meetings, pitching vague concepts that sounded suspiciously similar to Morgan's pipeline projects. I even leased office space in the same district, making sure the board heard about it through their network of spies. Richard called me directly, trying to sound paternal. "Olivia, this vendetta helps no one. If you sign a comprehensive non-compete agreement, we could discuss a more generous severance package." "I appreciate the concern, Richard," I replied smoothly, "but I'm quite happy with my new direction. Prometheus has already secured initial funding commitments." That was technically true. I'd committed my own funds to it. Let him interpret it however he wanted. The psychological warfare intensified. I had allies inside Morgan Biotech feed specific information to known gossips. Olivia's met with 3 of our biggest clients. She's filed patents that could compete with our Phase 2 trials. Each rumor was crafted to be plausible but unprovable, keeping the board chasing shadows. Meanwhile, the real damage was happening in the market. The uncertainty I'd created was working better than anticipated. Morgan Biotech's stock price continued its gradual descent, down 15% over 3 weeks, as investors grew nervous about leadership stability and potential competition. The financial press picked up the story. Founder's daughter stakes competing claim in biotech dynasty. The board's response was predictable. They accelerated their plans to sell to Apex. If they were going to strip the company for parts, better to do it before I could establish a real competitor. They didn't realize they were playing exactly into my hands. As the stock price dropped, more shares hit the market. Nervous investors, particularly smaller funds without inside information, decided to cut their losses. I bought every share through my network of shell companies, each purchase just small enough to avoid SEC reporting requirements. My 75.1% grew to 78%, then 80%. The masterstroke came when I leaked something more concrete, a rumor that Prometheus had successfully recruited Dr. Kim Leong, Morgan's star oncology researcher. This was completely false. Dr. Leong was actually one of my inside allies, feeding me information about the board's panic, but his supposed defection sent shockwaves through the industry. If Kim's jumping ship, what does he know that we don't? Analysts asked. The board called an emergency all-hands meeting. Richard stood at the podium, trying to project strength while the company hemorrhaged perceived value. "Let me be clear," he announced to the assembled employees. "Any attempts to solicit our researchers, steal our intellectual property, or damage this company's reputation will be met with the full force of legal action. We've built something valuable here, and we won't let anyone tear it down out of spite." I watched the live stream from my apartment, noting which employees looked skeptical, which seemed angry, which appeared ready to bolt. My phone buzzed with texts from allies inside. "He's scared. You should see the board members' faces. When do we strike?" "Soon," I replied to each. "Very soon." The board made their final mistake out of desperation. They moved up the Apex acquisition timeline, scheduling a special shareholder meeting in just 2 weeks to approve the strategic partnership corporate doublespeak for selling out. They needed a simple majority to push it through, and with their 31% plus Apex's promised proxy support from other investors, they thought they had it locked. What they didn't know was that Apex's promised support included several funds that had already secretly pledged their shares to me. The buyer thought they were getting a compliant target. Instead, They were walking into an ambush. I let the announcement stand for exactly 24 hours, long enough for the media to pick it up, for employees to panic, for the real shareholders to understand what was at stake. Then I called Elena Volkov at North Star. "It's time," I said simply. "Finally," she replied. "I was starting to think you enjoyed the theater too much to end the show." "Every good performance needs a climax," I said, looking at my war room walls, now covered in green. "And this one's going to bring down the house." The next morning, business journalists received an anonymous package containing select excerpts from the board's emails, nothing legally actionable yet, but enough to raise serious questions about conflicts of interest and the true value of the Apex deal. The stock price tumbled another 5% by lunch. Meanwhile, I filed the formal paperwork with the SEC, revealing my 80% stake for the first time. The filing hit the wire services at 2:47 p.m., 13 minutes before market close. The headlines were instantaneous. Morgan's daughter returns with controlling stake. Hostile takeover from inside the family. Morgan Biotech board faces coup. My phone exploded with calls. Reporters, analysts, board members, my mother. I ignored them all except one. "Hello, Richard?" I answered his call with professional calm. "I believe we need to discuss the agenda for the shareholder meeting. I have some additions to propose." The silence on his end was long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its patronizing warmth. "You clever little bitch," he breathed. "No, Richard," I corrected him. "I'm James Morgan's daughter, and you should have remembered what that means." The war was about to end, not with a whimper, but with an explosion that would reshape everything they thought they'd stolen. The call came at midnight, 3 days after I'd revealed my hand. I was reviewing shareholder agreements when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. "Olivia," the voice was gravelly, aged but still commanding. Frank Morrison, no relation despite the similar surname, my father's first CFO and longest-serving board member until he'd retired 5 years ago. "I've been watching this circus from my vineyard in Napa. Thought I was done with corporate warfare." "Frank," I sat up straighter, even though he couldn't see me. "This man had taught me to read balance sheets when I was 12. I didn't know you still followed the company." "Your father built something worth following. Although what's happening now?" He paused, and I heard ice clinking in a glass. "I still have friends inside. Good people who remember what Morgan Biotech used to stand for. They tell me interesting things." My pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" "The kind that might interest the SEC, maybe the FBI's white-collar division. Richard's been sloppy, arrogant men usually are. That Cayman account he's been using to coordinate the share purchases. It's not as untraceable as he thinks. And the kickbacks from Apex." Another pause. "Let's just say I kept very good records during my tenure. Habits die hard." "Frank, are you saying—" "I'm saying I have a banker's box in my study that your father asked me to keep, just in case. He never trusted Richard. You know, said any man who'd marry his ex-wife was either a saint or a snake. And Richard never struck him as particularly holy." I laughed despite myself. It sounded like something Dad would say. "I'm flying down tomorrow," Frank continued. "Officially to visit my cardiologist, unofficially to deliver some materials that might interest you, and Olivia. Your father would be proud. You're playing this exactly how he would have: patient, thorough, devastating." After we hung up, I stared at my wall of conquests. 80% was enough to control the company. But Frank was offering something else: the ammunition to not just win, but to destroy those who'd betrayed my father completely. The next evening, Frank arrived at my apartment carrying a box that looked innocuous enough. Inside were documents that made my previous intelligence look like grocery lists. Financial records showing Richard had been skimming from R&D budgets for years, funneling money through contractors that existed only on paper. Email threads between board members discussing how to manipulate stock prices around FDA announcements. Most damning, a recorded conversation from 2 years ago where Richard explicitly discussed waiting for James to step aside, one way or another. "He wore a wire?" I asked, stunned. "Your father was many things," Frank said, sipping the whiskey I'd poured him. Naive wasn't one of them. After Richard married your mother, James started documenting everything. He suspected Richard was dirty but could never prove it. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got these. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Frank's expression was pained. Because I'm 73 years old with a bad heart, and I thought the board would at least honor James's memory by taking care of the company. I underestimated their greed. He met my eyes. Don't make the same mistake. When you go for the kill, make it clean. I spent the next 3 days with my lawyer, carefully reviewing every document. We had enough to trigger a federal investigation, but timing was everything. Drop it too early, and the board might find a way to spin it. Too late, and they might complete the Apex deal before justice caught up. The shareholder meeting was in 7 days. I needed the board focused on the corporate battle, not potential criminal charges. So I leaked just enough to keep them nervous. A reporter got an anonymous tip about irregularities in Morgan Biotech's books. An SEC examiner coincidentally decided to review our latest filings. Little pressure points, applied precisely. Meanwhile, my coalition solidified. The employees who'd pledged their shares started wearing small pins caduceus symbols, the medical emblem my father had chosen as our original logo before the marketing department modernized it. It was subtle, but the message was clear. We remember what this company stands for. Dr. Kim Leong, my supposed defector, played his role perfectly. In a carefully orchestrated private conversation at an industry mixer within earshot of a known board informant, he mentioned how Olivia's vision for Prometheus makes Morgan look outdated. She's talking about breakthrough applications that would revolutionize treatment protocols. The disinformation worked better than expected. The board panicked, pushing Apex to sweeten their offer to close the deal faster. They didn't realize that every desperate move they made created more evidence of their breach of fiduciary duty. 3 days before the meeting, I got an unexpected call from my mother. Richard's been acting strange, she said quietly. Pacing the house, making calls at all hours. Yesterday I heard him on the phone saying something about alternative measures if the vote doesn't go their way. Are you safe? I asked immediately. I'm at my sister's. Took a little vacation. Her voice hardened. I may have made the mistake of marrying him, but I'm not stupid. Olivia, be careful. Desperate men do desperate things. Her warning proved prescient. The next day, my lawyer received a cease and desist letter accusing me of corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and tortious interference with the Apex deal. It was legally nonsense I hadn't stolen anything or interfered with any contracts, but it was meant to intimidate, to make me defensive before the meeting. Instead, I counterfiled. My lawsuit accused the board of breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and waste of corporate assets. I attached just enough of Frank's evidence to make it clear this wasn't a bluff. The business press went wild. Morgan Biotech battle turns nuclear. Daughter's revenge threatens billion-dollar deal. Inside the ugliest corporate family feud of the decade. Thomas Garrett called me directly. This is insane. Olivia, you're going to destroy the company with this scorched earth approach. No, Thomas, I replied calmly. You destroyed it the day you decided to sell my father's life's work for 30 pieces of silver. I'm just here to collect the bill. With 48 hours until the meeting, I made my final preparations. Every proxy agreement was verified, every legal document prepared. My allies were briefed on the plan. Frank's evidence was packaged and ready to submit to authorities the moment the board was removed. The night before the battle, I stood in my war room one last time. Every wall was covered in green, now 80% of Morgan Biotech under my control. Tomorrow, I would walk back into the building they'd thrown me out of and take back what was mine. But it wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about justice. For my father. For the employees who'd believed in our mission. For the patients who needed our treatments. The board had taught me a valuable lesson when they betrayed me in corporate warfare. Mercy is a luxury you can't afford. Tomorrow, they would learn what happened when you crossed a Morgan. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room at 3 a.m., staring at the city lights and nursing a glass of my father's favorite scotch. a bottle I'd saved from his office before they could clear it out. Tomorrow would either vindicate everything I'd worked for or destroy me completely. My phone buzzed. Sarah Winters, texting from the lab, where she was pulling another all-nighter. Can't sleep either. The whole building feels electric. Everyone knows tomorrow changes everything. I smiled grimly. If the employees were feeling it inside, the board must be drowning in anxiety. Another text. This one from Elena Volkov. Final confirm North Star's 7% is yours. Give them hell. The messages kept coming as my allies checked in one by one. Marcus Thompson sent a photo of 20 employees raising glasses in a late-night toast to the real Morgan legacy. Dr. Leong forwarded screenshots of panicked board emails he'd been copied on by mistake. Even Frank Morrison, who should have been asleep at his age, sent a simple message, "Your father is with you tomorrow." By 4 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely. I went to my closet and pulled out the suit I'd chosen my father's favorite color. The deep blue, he said, reminded him of the ocean where he'd first conceived the idea for Morgan Biotech during a sabbatical in Maine. I laid it out carefully, like armor for battle. My best friend Emma arrived at 6 a.m. with coffee and bagels. She took one look at me and wrapped me in a hug. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," she said. "In a way, I am." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "If this goes wrong, I'll have made very powerful enemies. Richard won't stop at just the company if I fail." "Then don't fail." Emma squeezed my shoulder. "Your dad used to say that the only fights worth having are the ones where losing isn't an option. This is that fight." She stayed while I got ready, keeping up a stream of chatter that helped quiet my racing thoughts. Stories from college, updates on mutual friends, anything but the battle ahead. It was exactly what I needed. My lawyer, Janet Crawford, called at 7:30. "Final numbers are locked. 80.3% confirmed. The nuclear option is armed and ready. The SEC is aware we'll be filing additional documents after the meeting depending on the outcome." "Any last-minute defections?" I asked, toweling my hair dry. "None. If anything, we've had 2 more small shareholders reach out wanting to join. I told them to watch the fireworks first." She paused. "Olivia, I've been doing corporate law for 20 years. I've never seen anyone pull together what you have in such a short time. Whatever happens today, you've already won something important." "We'll see if the board agrees," I said, but her words helped steady my nerves. By 8 a.m., my phone was ringing nonstop. Reporters wanting statements, analysts seeking insight, even a few board members making last-ditch attempts to negotiate. I ignored them all. The time for talk had passed. At 8:45, I stood before my bathroom mirror, applying makeup with steady hands despite the earthquake in my chest. The woman looking back at me wasn't the trusting COO who'd walked into that boardroom 3 months ago. Her eyes were harder, her smile sharper. She looked like someone who could burn down kingdoms. She looked like her father's daughter. Emma drove me to the Morgan Biotech building, knowing I'd need the support. As we pulled up, I saw the media circus already forming news vans. Photographers, business reporters with their perfect hair and hungry expressions. Security was trying to keep them corralled, but the energy was electric. "Jesus," Emma breathed. "It's like a premiere." "It is," I said. "The premiere of the end of their world." I stepped out of the car, and immediately the cameras swung my way. Reporters shouted questions. "Ms. Morgan, are you planning to block the Apex deal? Is it true you have 80% control? What would your father think of this battle?" I walked past them without a word, my heels clicking on the pavement with metronomic precision. Let them speculate. In an hour, they'd have their story. The security guard at the desk, Jerome, who'd worked there for 15 years, looked up as I approached. His face went through several expressions before settling on something like relief. "Ms. Morgan," he said quietly, "welcome back." "Thank you, Jerome." I signed the visitor log with deliberate care. "It's good to be home." The elevator ride to the boardroom floor felt both endless and too quick. Each floor that passed was a memory the lab where I'd learned to use a microscope. The break room where Dad and I would eat lunch when I was home from college. The office where he died at his desk, working until the end. Emma squeezed my hand. You've got this. The boardroom doors were closed, but I could hear voices inside tense, argumentative. They knew I was coming. Good. Let them sweat. At exactly 9:29, I turned to Emma. Whatever you hear in the next hour, don't come in. This needs to be between me and them. Kick their asses, she said fiercely. I smoothed my suit one last time, gripped my briefcase containing the proxies that represented 80.3% of Morgan Biotech, and checked my phone. 9:30 a.m. Time to reclaim my birthright. I pushed open the boardroom doors and stepped into the arena. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. 8 pairs of eyes turned to me, some nervous, some defiant, all recognizing that their carefully constructed coup was about to face its reckoning. Good morning, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. I believe we have business to discuss. Richard's face went from red to white to red again. You have no right to be here. Security. Actually, I said, setting my briefcase on the table with deliberate calm. I have every right. Would you like to see the documentation, or shall we skip to the part where you all resign? The war for Morgan Biotech had led to this moment. Everything the betrayal, the investigation, the secret alliance building had brought me back to this room where they'd tried to destroy me. Now it was my turn. Security won't be necessary, I said, opening my briefcase with practiced calm. Unlike 3 months ago, I'm here as the majority shareholder of Morgan Biotech Solutions, 80.3%, to be exact. The room erupted. Thomas Garrett shot to his feet. That's impossible. We've been tracking every trade. You've been tracking what I wanted you to track. I pulled out the stack of proxy agreements, each one a nail in their coffin. While you were chasing shadows with Prometheus Biosystems, I was collecting the real prize. Margaret Liu's face had gone ashen. Those shell companies, the Delaware LLCs. All perfectly legal, I confirmed, laying the documents on the table. Unlike, say, coordinating stock manipulation through Cayman Island accounts, or taking kickbacks from Apex Pharmaceuticals, or, I paused, savoring their growing horror, embezzling from R&D budgets for the past 3 years. Richard slammed his hand on the table. You're bluffing. You have nothing. Frank Morrison says hello. By the way, I watched the blood drain from Richard's face. He's been keeping such interesting records. Did you really think you could skim from the research budget without anyone noticing? Those phantom contractors were creative, but not creative enough. This is corporate blackmail, someone sputtered. No, I corrected. Blackmail would be if I threatened to release this information unless you complied. I'm not threatening anything. The SEC will receive these documents at 10:31 a.m., exactly 1 hour from now. The only question is whether you'll still be board members when they do. Janet Crawford, my lawyer, entered the room right on cue, wheeling in boxes of additional documentation. For the record, she announced, I'm filing notice of an extraordinary shareholder meeting pursuant to Section 47B of the corporate bylaws. As Ms. Morgan controls more than 75% of outstanding shares, she has the authority to reverse any and all board decisions, effective immediately. Including, I added, your decision to remove me as COO. The board members looked at each other like trapped animals. Some were calculating, trying to find an exit. Others were simply in shock. Richard, though Richard's face had transformed into something ugly and desperate. You think you've won? He leaned forward, voice dropping to a hiss. You have no idea what you're playing with. Apex has contracts ready to sign, international partners lined up. You'll destroy billions in value with this tantrum. Whose value? I shot back. Yours? The $30 million you were promised for delivering our patent portfolio. I pulled out another document, Richard's private agreement with Apex, obtained through Frank's sources. Or maybe Margaret's 15 million, Thomas's 20. Each name came with its own document, its own proof of betrayal. I laid them out like tarot cards predicting their doom. The employees you were about to sell out, their value matters. The patients who need our affordable treatments, their value matters. The research my father dedicated his life to, that value is priceless. I stood, spreading my hands on the table. You forgot what this company was built for. You thought it was just another asset to strip and sell. Enough theatrics, Margaret tried to rally. Even with 80%, you need board approval for major decisions. We still… Actually, you don't, I smiled, and it wasn't kind. Because you're all fired, effective immediately. You can't… I can… Section 52C. In cases of demonstrated breach of fiduciary duty, the majority shareholder may remove board members without cause or notice. I gestured to the boxes Janet had brought. Would you like to discuss what constitutes demonstrated breach? Because I have 17 boxes of evidence that I think makes it pretty clear. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and someone's labored breathing. I'll give you a choice, I continued, checking my watch. Resign now, quietly, and I'll consider not pursuing personal lawsuits against each of you. The criminal investigation will proceed that's out of my hands now, but at least you'll avoid civil litigation that would drain whatever golden parachutes you've arranged. This is a coup, Richard spat. No, I corrected him again. What you did 3 months ago was a coup. This is a restoration. One by one, they broke. Margaret Liu was first. Her hands shaking as she pushed her resignation letter across the table Janet had thoughtfully prepared them in advance. Thomas Garrett followed, then the others, until only Richard remained. You're just like your father, he said, but he meant it as an insult. Stubborn, self-righteous, unable to see the bigger picture. Thank you, I replied sincerely. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Security arrived then not for me, but at my request. These former board members need to be escorted out, I instructed. Please collect their company devices and access badges. Legal will coordinate the return of any personal items after review. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 3 months ago, they'd had me marched out like a criminal. Now they filed past me, heads down, as security waited to escort them from the building they'd tried to steal. Richard was last. He stopped at the door, turning back with pure hatred in his eyes. This isn't over. Yes, I said simply. It is. As the door closed behind them, I sank into my father's chair, a chair now. The boardroom was empty except for Janet, who was already preparing documents for the new board I'd assembled. Frank Morrison had agreed to come out of retirement. Dr. Winters would represent the research division, and other allies who understood what Morgan Biotech was meant to be. The proxies are all verified, Janet reported. The filings are ready in exactly, she checked her watch, 15 minutes. The SEC receives everything. The media has been alerted to stand by for a major announcement. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and something else, satisfaction. My phone buzzed. Emma, watching from the lobby. Security just marched 8 very unhappy people past me. Either you won or you're about to have company in exile. We won, I texted back. The financial news alerts started within minutes. Breaking Morgan Biotech board, ousted in hostile takeover by founder's daughter. Apex deal dead, as Morgan Air seizes control. SEC investigating dismissed Morgan Biotech board members. I walked to the window, looking out at the city my father had loved. Somewhere out there, Richard and his co-conspirators were watching their carefully constructed scheme crumble. By tomorrow, they'd be facing federal investigators. Their reputations were destroyed, their golden parachutes evaporated. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that Morgan Biotech would survive. The research would continue. The patients would keep getting affordable treatments. The employees would keep their jobs. We did it, Dad, I whispered to the glass. We got it back. The war was over. I'd won. And unlike them, I knew exactly what to do with victory. The boardroom was quiet now, just me and the ghosts of what had transpired. I walked slowly around the table, running my fingers along its polished surface, remembering all the meetings I'd attended here as a child. Perched on my father's lap while he discussed quarterly projections and research breakthroughs. Janet had left to file the paperwork and brief the media. The new board members would arrive soon for our first official meeting. But for now, it was just me in this room where everything had fallen apart and come together again. I settled into the CEO's chair, my chair, and opened my laptop. There was so much work ahead, reassuring employees, calming investors, meeting with the research teams to revive the projects Richard had tried to kill. But first, I had one more thing to do. I pulled out my father's lucky pen, the one I'd carried out of this building 3 months ago, and wrote by hand on official Morgan Biotech letterhead, "To all Morgan Biotech employees. Today marks a new chapter in our company's history. The values my father instilled in this organization, innovation with purpose, profits with principles, success with soul, will guide us forward. The attempted sale to Apex is terminated. Your jobs are secure. Our mission continues. Olivia Morgan, CEO." As I signed my name, sunlight broke through the clouds, flooding the boardroom with golden light. It felt like a blessing, like my father's hand on my shoulder one more time. My phone rang. It was my mother. "I heard," she said simply. "Richard's packing his things. His lawyer called something about freezing assets and federal investigations." "Are you okay?" I asked. She laughed, and it sounded lighter than I'd heard in years. "I'm filing for divorce. Should have done it long ago. But I was trying to preserve. I don't know what I was trying to preserve. Your father would have been horrified that I let Richard near his company." "Dad would have understood," I said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is fixing them." "You sound just like him." Her voice was warm now. "He'd be so proud. Olivia, you didn't just save his company, you honored everything he stood for." After we hung up, I stood and walked to the wall of photographs, company milestones, breakthrough moments, celebrations of lives saved through our research. My father featured in many of them. That brilliant smile and determined eyes that saw possibilities where others saw problems. Soon, there would be new photos, new breakthroughs, new lives saved. But they would build on the foundation he laid, not tear it down for parts. Frank Morrison arrived first, moving slower than I remembered, but with eyes still sharp as surgical instruments. "Well done," he said simply, taking his seat. "Your father always said you had the mind for business, but worried you had too much heart for the ugliness it sometimes requires. He was wrong. You have just enough of both." Dr. Winters came next. Then the other new board members, people who understood that profit and purpose weren't mutually exclusive, that a biotech company's true value lay not in its stock price, but in its impact on human lives. Our first meeting was everything the old boards hadn't been: transparent, collaborative, focused on long-term vision rather than short-term gain. We approved funding for the Parkinson's research Richard had tried to cancel. We expanded the compassionate use program. We even discussed my father's last dream clinics in underserved communities that would bring cutting-edge treatment to those who needed it most. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I found myself alone in my father's office, my office now. Everything was as he'd left it, from the molecular models on the shelves to the photo of us at my Harvard graduation. I poured 2 glasses of his scotch, setting one on the desk where he used to place his evening drink. "We did it, Dad," I said to the empty chair. "They thought they could erase what you built, but they forgot the most important thing you taught me, that real power isn't in the shares you control or the boards you sit on. It's in the people who believe in your vision, the lives you touch, the legacy you leave." I raised my glass to his photo, to his memory, to the company he'd built and I'd saved. "To Morgan Biotech," I whispered. "To second chances and righteous revenge. To proving that sometimes the good guys win." The scotch burned warm down my throat as the city lights began to twinkle beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, Richard and his conspirators were facing the consequences of their betrayal. The employees were celebrating. Patients were getting treatments they needed. The future my father envisioned was secure. I'd been voted out, humiliated, discarded by people I'd trusted. But I'd returned not just to reclaim my position, but to claim something more: the knowledge that when pushed to the brink, I had my father's courage, my mother's resilience, and a network of allies who believed in more than just the bottom line. They'd created their own worst enemy when they'd betrayed me, because they'd transformed a trusting daughter into a CEO who understood that in business, as in life, the best revenge isn't just winning, it's winning so completely that your enemies become footnotes in your success story. I smiled, settling into my father's chair with tomorrow's agenda. There was work to do, lives to save, a legacy to honor. Morgan Biotech was home, and I was exactly where I belonged. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate betrayal and sweet revenge. I hope Olivia's journey reminded you that sometimes the biggest wins come from the deepest losses. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of boardroom justice, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Olivia's position? Let me know in the comments.